Hey now, this is Rob with Kern River Fly Shop and Buhler Bros Flies. Today we're going to be tying my #1 go-to small streamer pattern, the Sierra Clouser or the Micro Clouser. It's a variation on the classic Clouser deep minnow, substituting squirrel tail for the belly and wing instead of the traditional bucktail on the larger style Clouser deep minnow. I tie this in size 10 to 14 and even down to 16. And fishes extremely well on all western waterways, from your warm waters, fishing for bluegill and bass, fishes surprisingly well for carp, and then all your trout waterways up to your backcountry lakes, representing the small fry in those backcountry lakes too. So we'll start off talking about the hook we're using, which is a 52-62 streamer hook in size 10, and this is from the Fly Shop out of Reading. They make their own series of hooks, which is equivalent to the Tiemco series of hooks. And then we're using a 6/0 uni thread in white. And we're going to attach that about 1/3 of the way back on the hook shank here, creating a little thread bump to rest those dumbbell eyes on when we tie those in. And we'll trim our excess. And there's all kinds of dumbbell eyes or brass eyes and hourglass eyes you can use on the market today. We're using just a simple black one here in a small size, 532. Just make sure they're heavy enough to invert whatever hook you're using to allow that hook to ride in that classic Clouser style. And we're going to take the dumbbell eye and attach it. Rest it on your side of the hook shank at a slight angle and come over the top with a really tight thread wrap to move it into place, and do 3, 4, 5 of those on the one side, and then come back on the other side with tight securing wraps to move those dumbbell eyes into position, an even amount. And make sure those first wraps are nice and secure. If the first few wraps are loose, it's difficult to tighten everything up after that. Relatively straight and even there. We can do a couple more securing wraps and crisscross, and then we're going to go underneath those dumbbell eyes on each side of the hook shank several times, and that'll just add a little more security to help keep them from rolling over. And then a couple more crisscross wraps on top, finishing up in front of those dumbbell eyes. And for the wing material, we're going to use squirrel tail. It's got a nice modeling to it going through the length of that fiber, and then finishes with a nice clear tip. This is a gray squirrel tail, so it's got relatively white tips. And we're going to prepare that by pulling it out at a 90-degree angle from the shank and aligning the tips. And then you can grab a small clump off of there and trim that at the base of the tail. And after you get a small clump removed, take those tips and grab them with your material hand and stroke out the excess fluff and shorter fibers from the base of that clump. This will allow for a better tie-in, a cleaner tie-in, and then better moving tips once it gets wet in the water. A nice soft material, that squirrel tail. Then we're going to measure it to length, about 2 lengths of the hook shank, and we're going to trim the tips before we tie it in. So we're going to get that measurement right at the hook eye, transfer our materials to the material hand, and trim the tips at that point. Trim that butt off, make a nice clean tie-in area, and drop that down on our side of the hook, just in front of those dumbbell eyes, with the first wrap being relatively loose, and the second and third wraps will come up and secure the material on top of the hook shank, coming forward to the eye, and then we'll come back to the dumbbell eyes. Now we need to go behind the eyes to secure the material behind it, and we're going to go underneath that eye and then up and over the squirrel tail. Bring that down nice and tight to the hook shank, and then work our way back about 2/3 of the way back on the hook. And the last couple wraps, keep it relatively loose. We don't want to flare that tail too much. So we got our belly tied in, and then we're going to add a little bit of flash at this point. I like to add a red holographic Flashabou. Represents either flared gills or a little injured and wounded bait fish or fry. So we'll take 3 of those strands and trim the tips even for tying in. And we're going to tie that in right where we have our thread resting. And move that thread forward to behind the dumbbell eyes and rest our thread there again. And wrap our Flashabou around the hook, covering up our thread wraps. As we move forward, and then we'll move all the way up to behind the dumbbell eyes. And again, this represents the little flared gills or a little wounded bait fish or fry. I like a little bit of red in almost all my bait fish patterns. And then bring that thread up in front of the eyes, and one more securing wrap to secure that flash up there too. And we'll trim our excess at that point. And we have on this vise right now, it's called a Clouser arm that extends straight out like that. If you have a standard arm, just take the hook out of the vise and flip it over at this point. I'm just going to roll this one over. And then we're going to add our flash to the middle of the fly, or the lateral line. And again, we're going to use Flashabou. We're going to use a pearl olive Flashabou. And you can use crystal flash, but the crystal flash isn't as soft, so it won't swim as well. It's a little stiffer, and it'll inhibit the movement of that squirrel tail on these smaller flies. So I like to use Flashabou. We'll take 4 strands, trim the tips even, drop that in on your side of the hook, wrap that in, and then as you come back to the dumbbell eyes, keep the material directly on top of the hook shank. And then you can separate it by the hook here and put 2 pieces on each side of that hook. There we go. And then we'll put our wing in, same material as the belly, but we're going to change the color and use an olive for the wing on this one. You can see those nice clear olive tips. And when I'm tying the Sierra Clousers, I generally, just like the standard Clouser, I'll tie the darker material on top, lighter material on the bottom. In the darker colors, this fishes extremely well as a leech pattern with purple on the bottom and black on the top of the wing. And then we're going to, again, prepare this by grabbing just the tips and stroking out all the excess fibers there. And then instead of measuring it to the hook shank, we're just going to measure to our belly on our wing and do the same length as the belly. Transfer hands and trim our excess. Trim all those butts off. And then keep the tips, keep your thumbs right up on those tips. The more you have exposed, the more difficult it is to tie in. We'll rest it just on our side of the hook shank and do one soft wrap, and then the second and third will be securing wraps as we come forward, and then move our way back to the dumbbell eyes with more securing wraps, keeping the material on top of the hook shank. We lost a couple hairs there, but that's okay. The bulk of them are tied in very securely there. And then we can separate the hair on either side of the hook, just as we did the Flashabou, and trim our Flashabou just past the tail. And we can finish the fly here by tapering off the head just a little bit and finishing off the knots, but I'd like to add a little more attraction to the head. So we're going to take 3 more of those pearl olive Flashabou fibers and wrap those just in front of the dumbbell eye. Oop, there's one more tail Flashabou we need to trim there. There we go. And so we'll attach 3 more Flashabou pearl olive Flashabou in front of the eyes. And this kind of just completes that baitfish profile, adds a little more attraction to the head up here. And taper that as you go to the eye up here. Rest the thread at the front. And we can wrap our Flashabou. If the Flashabou slides down your thread at all, you can before you wrap it, you can put a little glue on that thread and it'll help keep it from sliding. Once we get up to the front, we'll take a couple thread wraps to tie that off. Trim our excess. It just makes a little cleaner, more complete fly and adds a little bit more attraction too. And then we can finish with either a whip finish, series of whip finishes here, or half hitch knots. I like the half hitch. We'll do 3 quick half hitches. Trim our excess. And traditionally it's finished with an epoxy. If I'm doing larger amounts, I'll finish with the 30-minute Z-epoxy resin, 2-part resin, super durable, bomb-proof. If I'm doing smaller batches, I'll finish with either Zap-A-Gap or a Raid Zap, which is a newer UV material, flexible and tack-free. So that's basically your little Clouser, micro Clouser streamer. You can use all the same techniques I used here for your standard Clouser minnow tie-in, and hopefully you guys can tie up a few of these before the next video and get out on the water and catch a few fish. Good luck.